put an end to the crisis by just guaranteeing a low interest rate on the bonds, especially of Spain and Italy, which they could do with much less money than the Federal Reserve has created here in the United States. They don't want to do this because they know once the crisis is over, they don't have any leverage to force these countries to do things that people in those countries would never vote for, okay, and are in the streets fighting against. That is that's the underlying problem in Europe. Now there it's very clear, okay? I think it's very clear what's going on there. You know, here it's a little bit hazier because you don't have as much of, well, it's not quite as bad here, and you can see politically Obama's going to win his election most likely because he can go to the public and say, you know, we were losing jobs at 700,000 a month when I took office, and now we've gained X million jobs, and so we're doing better. And if you look at the political science studies on elections, you see that that's pretty much determines most elections in the national elections in the United States, is what's happening to the economy and the rate at which it's improving. That's, you know, in the off-year elections, that's 92% of the variance. And that will probably be enough for him, and so why should he take any other risk? But in Europe, you've had 5 governments fall already for this stupidity. And, you know, so it is a little harder to explain why they would continue along a path which causes so much unnecessary suffering. So, I want to leave time for question and answer, so I should probably move away from Europe unless there's something I didn't, well, if there's something I didn't explain, you can ask. But I want to look a little bit at the developing world too, and at Latin America especially, because that's our hemisphere and that's one of the areas that we look at a lot. But the developing world, as I said, it was hit by this as well. And that's why they're upset. And you know, you even had the Brazilian foreign minister said last year, you know, you want us to contribute more money to the IMF for Europe? Which I always thought was a little weird. I mean, these countries have a fraction of the per capita income of Europe, and here Europe has the ability to take care of themselves, and they just won't do it. And they're coming to India and China and Brazil and saying, could you please give more money to the IMF for Europe? And finally, the foreign minister of Brazil said, well, yeah, okay, we might be willing to contribute, but we want to see some policies that encourage growth. Okay, so they have to depend. It's kind of ironic that the Brazilians to stick up for the interests of Europe because their elected governments won't do it. But you have in Latin America, you have governments that were hit by this. And I want to say just briefly in terms of the policy question, they did a lot of good things during the first world recession. So they were able to use counter-cyclical policy some in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Argentina, for example. And so in other words, they used expansionary fiscal policy. In Ecuador, that was all they could do, you know, because they don't even have their own currency. They have the dollar. So they had to be especially creative, but they did it. And I won't go into all the details. Now, some of them didn't do the right thing. You know, Venezuela, for example, when the price of oil crashed in the last quarter of 2008, they got scared and they cut back on spending, and as a result, they had one of the more serious recessions. But that was just a mistake. But I'm emphasizing Latin America for 2 reasons. One is because you've had a huge change in Latin America, which some of you may know about. That, you know, South America in particular has now almost all left governments. And this is something that's never happened before. And they're now more independent of the United States than Europe is. And so they were able to pursue more independent policies. And this is part of the reason why some of their economic policies have gotten a lot better. And I'll just give you one number that sums up, I think, the progress there in 5 of the left governments. They all had a big reduction in poverty from the time that the left governments took power. So if you look at Argentina, from 2001 to 2009, poverty dropped by half. And now it's really closer to 2/3. And that's using independent estimates of inflation, by the way. In Bolivia, only 4 years of data we have, it's dropped from 60% to 51%. In Brazil, it dropped from 34% to 21%. In Ecuador, it dropped, and that was over 7 years. In Ecuador, in just 5 years, it dropped from 37% to 28%. And in Venezuela, it dropped from 55% in 1998 to 33% today. And of course, if you, and they, I have to say, had a special case because the first 4 years they couldn't do anything because they couldn't control the oil industry, which was controlled by the opposition. So in all of these countries, you've had real progress, and you've had progress because they were able to change their economic policies to varying degrees. You know, Brazil, still very handicapped because they have this powerful central bank, this powerful financial industry. Well, I should say it's the financial industry that controls the central bank. So they were able to do something. They were able to reduce poverty by a lot because they still had the best growth they've had for years, and they have record levels of employment. And that's really, you know, what they did the most. This shows you that governments can do other things, even under tough circumstances. To me, the best example of all this, and I'll end with this one, is this part is Argentina, because that to me is directly comparable to Greece. You know, they had a very similar situation. They had from 1998 to 2001, they had enormous losses, a huge recession. They were doing what Greece is trying to do. It's called an internal devaluation, where you can't change your exchange rate in nominal terms because, you know, Greece has the euro. And so, and Argentina was pegged to the dollar, the peso. So you actually try to shrink, you shrink wages, basically. That's how you do it. In other words, you make your real exchange rate lower by pushing down wages. And I swear to you, this is true. It sounds like a conspiracy theory because, you know, all the stuff you've seen in Greece, the 16% loss in output, the increase in unemployment to 21% now, all of that is part of the process of internal devaluation. That is how the European authorities and the IMF back in Argentina said, you have to get out of this. You have to actually create so much unemployment that you can push wages down so far that then you will become competitive internationally. That is in there. That's in the IMF agreements. That is actually the process by which these governments recover. And it makes, you know, if you know macroeconomics a bit, you know that that makes sense, because if you can't change your macroeconomic policy, in other words, you can't use expansionary fiscal policy, or your opposite, you're going in the wrong direction, and you can't control your monetary policy because the European Central Bank is terrified of the inflation monster, okay, then that's all that's left is your exchange rate, and you can't move the exchange rate either. So you have to move it in nominal terms, so you have to move it in real terms by pressing down wages and prices in your own country. And that failed miserably. Now, in Argentina, just as it's failed horribly in Greece. And what the Argentines did was they abandoned that. They defaulted on their debt at the end of 2001. They abandoned the pegged exchange rate. And since then, the economy has grown over 90% in 9 years.